SSRP offers academically strong, intrinsically motivated students the opportunity to immerse themselves in a topic of particular interest. It is like programs in other exceptional independent schools around the world. I was part of one of the original programs like SSRP, but our program is unique in that it allows students more choice in the area of study than others, and our foundational methods course, mentoring, and director are stronger than others I've encountered. So, needless to say, I am proud of what this idea has become. Clearly, this event is also an opportunity to reflect on the importance of academic scholarship. One of my former faculty members is an extraordinary teacher, an academic leader, one of the National Association of Independent Schools' first teachers of the future, and she will be the next head of school at Penn Charter in Philadelphia, one of the oldest independent schools in the country, established 1689. As a teacher, she is tireless and intense. Really intense. Scary intense. And students learn to love her. When I first read her end-of-term comments, though, she referred to her top students as scholars. At first, I was a little struck and frankly put off. Young scholars, it didn't quite make sense. For example, I knew some truly outstanding scholars at Yale, and honestly, I also knew that I wasn't one of them. So it struck me as odd to assign that title to an upper school student. Over a few years working together, I grew to understand and appreciate her use of this designation. She expected more than simply grades and test scores. She expected scholarship from her students. She knew that to be extraordinary, students need to be intellectuals and truly engage with the material they are learning. This teacher truly believes that any student could be exceptional if they were involved and thoughtful and curious, and she wanted to recognize those who met those expectations with the title of Young Scholar. Broadly, scholars love learning, engage with their teachers and with other students, are excited to learn the answers and apply their knowledge. Scholars share their ideas, like we will today. Go beyond the normal or average expectations to understand or learn or question just a little bit more. They are excited by challenges and know that it is essential to learn from mistakes. And scholars appreciate and respect the intellect of others. Ultimately, scholarship requires constant effort and attention to details from students, teachers, academics, and all learners. All can improve, but I appreciate my friend's desire to believe in and encourage the highest level of academic engagement, a worthy goal for all of us at the O'Neill School. Today's SSRP presenters all exhibit the qualities and have earned the title of scholar. I am eager to learn more about their work this afternoon, and while I'm disappointed to have missed this morning's presentation to the upper school, I get to experience learning from all of them with this audience. Thank you all for being here to support these special students and this unique program. While the current scholars are finishing their work, others are just beginning. The class of 2023 SSRP scholars are Max Epstein and Emma Sager, and the class of 2024 scholars are Caroline Acker, Audrey Kim, Tyler Pastor, Luke Harper, and Rachel Wolf. Could you all please stand and be recognized? Dr. Camastra has been instrumental in developing the SSRP program, and O'Neill is grateful for her thoughtful work in launching the program and leading these students through a very special process. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Camastra to begin our program.
Well, good afternoon. Good to see you guys. Thank you for that introduction, John. For many of you, you know me, If you don't know me, I'm Dr. Nicole Camastro. I'm chair of the English department and director of the Signature Scholar Research Program. During the 2-year course of study for SSRP, students read and write a lot. They work with faculty mentors, they give several small presentations, and they forge connections with experts in their field. The culminating project for SSRP is either a paper of 10,000 words or a project of similar relative weight and value. All 3 of these young women have written well over 10,000 words, and 2 of them have submitted excerpts of their paper for consideration in scholarly journals. The SSRP also culminates in a research symposium. That's a meeting or conference designed to discuss a subject. Well, some people ask. Audience awareness of defining things. And as Mr. Elmore pointed out, scholarship is no good kept to itself. Part of the reason we research things is to share that knowledge with the community. So thank you so much for attending our inaugural symposium for SSRP. It is designed for the O'Neill community to witness and celebrate the incredible accomplishments of these 3 women. Take it from me, I've spent many years in graduate school for master's and PhD, and I'm not exaggerating when I tell you that the work they've done is tantamount to graduate level work. This does not mean that they've crossed the proverbial finish line, for scholarship is a marathon, not a sprint. We often use sports metaphors to illustrate determination and perseverance. We love a straightforward narrative that pits winner against loser, triumph against defeat, and sometimes we confuse physical prowess with grit, but resilience is made manifest in many ways. We admire the soccer player, the tennis star, the basketball wonder, and that's okay. But we rarely stand in awe of the scholar who spends countless hours alone, striving to know more than they did yesterday and to bring that knowledge to others for the greater good. Scholarship and writing are lonely practices. They must be carried out in solitude, which requires strength of character. Ultimately, the force of character is cumulative, as Ralph Waldo Emerson put it, your favorite. These women have worked ceaselessly for months, and yet their enthusiasm for their work and each other's is indefatigable. They personify determination. They humble me with their tenacity and perspicacity. I am honored to write and read and learn in their company. I hope you enjoy their presentations and that you will join me in congratulating them on this most impressive accomplishment. I am going to introduce each of our speakers in turn. Another note on the format of this evening's symposium. They will each talk, Stephanie, followed by Emily, followed by Victoria. In between each speaker, we'll have a 3 to 5 minute break if you need to use the restroom. But please feel free to help yourself to refreshments throughout the presentations. We will have a Q&A at the end. Okay? Our first speaker, valedictorian of the class of 2022, Stephanie Deaker, moved to North Carolina in 2019. While she's an active member of programs such as the Honor Council, Model United Nations, and Student Forum, she can often be found baking in the early hours of the morning. Stephanie has been researching the Tudors since 8th grade and plans to pursue her research by majoring in history at Washington and Lee University.
So today we're going to be talking about the contributions of 5 Tudor women, the Tudors being a royal family ruling in the 15th and 16th century in England. More specifically, the title of my paper is The Hearts and Stomachs of Kings, How 5 Tudor Women Contributed to Power in a Period of Agnatic Primogeniture. What is agnatic primogeniture? The big question of the day. It sounds really complicated, but if you break it up, it means firstborn for primogeniture and through the father's line through agnatic. Put that together, it means the firstborn son is going to inherit the titles, the claim, the land, the money, and the fame of their family. That social construct is prevalent throughout history in Europe, in the world, and is a serious problem or issue in the 15th and 16th century. And we can juxtapose that with the influence and the power and the tenacity and agency that the women of the Tudor family are able to have to contribute to their overarching Tudor family success. Before we go any further, to contextualize some trivia. If you think you know the answer, just raise your hand. What type of government does England have now?
B.
Constitutional monarchy. You're so right. This was the same question for morning meeting, so I'm glad you learned something. The next question is a little different. How many women have ruled England? Tyler.
B.
No, it's not 4. It is the trick answer, 6-ish. While 6 women certainly have ruled England with the coronation and a period of reign all on their own, there's one woman that I use as the precedent for my paper, Empress Matilda, who in the 11th century ruled a portion of England for quite a long period of time. So while we like to think of kings and monarchs solely in England and women as the rarity, you can see all the way in the 11th century that a woman was ruling on her own. So back to contemporary England, like I said, England right now has a constitutional monarchy. In the Tudor period, they had an absolute monarchy. So that changes the way that we look at the monarchies in the 16th century and the way we look at them today. Hopefully you all know the woman standing, Elizabeth II, who is the current Queen of England, and she quite literally is a figurehead. Because of the way that the English government works today, it means that she has no power and she's just there to take people of England's money. And she has a good time doing it. And so the way that we see the monarchy today with Kate Middleton and Meghan Markle, do they like each other, do they not? It's a lot less about political power and much more about social capital. So we can see the change and the difference when we talk about the Tudors. Okay, so we've just discussed the Windsor family, who is the last in purple, the Saxe-Coburg/Windsors. They're the contemporary monarchs. And we're going back a few hundred years to the Tudors in green, starting in 1485. If I'm not baking in the wee hours of the morning, this is what I'm baking. And this is just a protracted family tree for the Tudors. Some context that you need to know when we talk about them is the Plantagenets are the ruling family before the Tudors become the ruling family of England. And right before they become that family, the Yorks and the Lancasters are sections of the Plantagenets that are fighting and vying for power. And the way that the Tudors come to power in the most basic terms is by reuniting the Yorks and the Lancasters back into one in 1485 when Henry VII marries Elizabeth of York. And you can see Henry circled in green as the first Tudor ruler. But before they can get married and just happily have a perfect family, we have to set up the Tudors. And so we can really look at them in 3 sections. With prefiguring with Catherine de Valois, securing the throne with Margaret Beaufort and Elizabeth of York, and canonizing with Elizabeth I and Margaret Tudor. If you're wondering what that image is, it's the Lady Chapel, which Margaret Beaufort and her son Henry VII worked to create together. In between each section, there's going to be a time for questions, so if you have a question about a specific section, just let me know. Okay, so we have Catherine de Valois starting at the very beginning of the 15th century. She's born into a period where England and France are fighting in what's called the 100 Years' War, which is misleading because it was 116 years, but nonetheless. We do like to simplify things. So she was the daughter of a French king, and she married into England to Henry V, which is really our first example of how we can see some women portraying some agency. The easiest way for a woman to do that in that time is by marrying, by giving her royal blood and the importance of her family to someone else to sort of establish a peace between England and France. Unfortunately, her husband, Henry V, the great warrior king, died, not in battle, and she was left with a toddler as a king. And so while he is ruling, she decides to defy Parliament. Parliament puts out a rule that says she will not be able to remarry until her son is old enough to choose her husband. She does not follow this rule, and she marries her servant, Owen Tudor, who quite literally, as legend has it, fell into her lap. They get married and they have 3 children, and so before the Tudors can become royals or have the opportunity to rule, they first need to have royal blood. That's the first step. And so by marrying Owen Tudor, she takes them from Welsh servants ruling in England as punishment, or living in England as punishment, to a noble family in England. She starts that step. Do you have any questions about this first prefiguring period? Yes?
What happened to her son?
Her son is about to marry the next woman I'm going to talk about, and he dies of plague in the 1450s. So there's that. Not very important. So the next period we have is securing, starting with Margaret Beaufort in 1453. So something we need to know about both Margaret Beaufort and her family is that at the time that she comes to power, she is born, the Beaufort family has this extremely important claim to the throne. While their family is complicated because of deaths, affairs, marriages, 16th century things, she is the one that carries that sole claim. Her father, his siblings, she didn't have any siblings. She's the only one with the Beaufort claim. So when she gets married and has a child when she's 12 years old to Edmund Tudor, who is Catherine de Valois' son, she passes that claim through the process of agnatic primogeniture to her son, Henry the Earl of Richmond. Because her husband dies when she's only 13, she has to remarry in order to garner protection for herself. Like in the 16th century, women had no technical rights, and so she has to find a way to have protection through a husband. She does this in order to protect her son, who has a dangerous claim. He could be killed at any moment. There's all sorts of chaos happening in England at the time. So the initial years of her life is working to keep Henry, her son, safe. Eventually, she sees the opportunity because, like I said, England has such a chaotic moment in time at this time. She sees the opportunity to start a rebellion. While that first rebellion fails, the second rebellion succeeds, and in 1485, on the Battle of Bosworth Field, Henry becomes Henry VII, and the Tudors are born as rulers. So she really is able to create the Tudor dynasty. She also works later to establish sort of a propaganda machine in order to keep the Tudors ruling, but that first step of making them rulers is really important for Margaret. And she succeeds with this second rebellion through the marriage alliance that she creates with Elizabeth of York and her son, Henry. So, like I said before, the war that's going on right now with the Yorks and Lancasters is creating a lot of tension, and Elizabeth of York carries the York claim, so she carries one side of this family. So when she marries Henry VII, at the time Henry the Earl of Richmond, they're able to unite those claims and create a peace between these two warring families, essentially ending a 30-year period of chaos called the Wars of the Roses. So she marries Henry, giving him that claim. We also can't forget the importance of producing heirs. While we can have Henry VII as an initial ruler, we can't have a Tudor empire until there are sons to carry on that empire. And so she has 2 sons and 2 daughters who survive to adulthood. Most importantly, Elizabeth of York is an extremely popular figure when she is a queen, which is important because Henry VII was not someone that would give you a hug if you asked him. He was very cold. He was often accused of being a miser. He didn't like to give away his money. Elizabeth of York, on the other hand, there are countless accounts of her going completely bankrupt because she would just give her money to anyone on the street. She was extremely charitable, loving, and gracious. And because the people loved her so much, in turn, they were able to love the Tudors. This is extremely important because, as I said before, they're coming off the back end of a rebellion, and just because they start being on the throne doesn't mean that they're there forever. It was very easy to start a rebellion, so by making them lovable, they're able to stay longer. And that ends the securing period. Do you have any questions about that? Okay, we'll move on to canonizing, which starts in 1533 with the birth of Elizabeth I and is continued today because I'm talking about them today. So Elizabeth I is probably the most well-known woman that I'm going to talk about. She's typically an icon in England because of the so-called feminist wonders that she is. She was bastardized when she was just 2 years old. If you know anything about Elizabeth I, you know that her father separated England from the Catholic Church in order to marry her mother, and then subsequently 2 years later beheaded her mother in order to marry someone else, which is really exciting. But it did leave Elizabeth with a lot of chaos to fix even as a little girl. When she comes to power in 1558, it's off the end of her father separating England from the Catholic Church, her brother who ruled after her father, making England even more Protestant, and then her sister doing a 180 and switching England back to Catholicism. So at that time, over about a 20-year period, England is having a huge issue with religion. There are a lot of religious wars and tension going on. So when Elizabeth comes to power in 1558, in 1559, she enacts the Acts of Uniformity and the Acts of Supremacy, which reestablishes the Church of England as the main religion in England. But it also allows for a lot of religious tolerance, which sort of helps to quell the religious issues in England at that time. So over the course of 20 years, the Tudors are known for enacting all of this religious chaos. And so by Elizabeth coming to power and being able to quell those religious issues, she also heals the Tudor narrative. Secondly, we also know Elizabeth for having never married anyone. And while this is interesting because it poses a lot of questions about her childhood and the way that she approached marriage, it also poses a lot of good things for the Tudors because she was never lending her power to a foreign figure. When her sister came to power, she married Philip II of Spain, a Catholic, and she was extremely ridiculed for the fact that she had given part of her power and part of England's power to Spain in that way. So by Elizabeth never marrying, she's able to keep that power and consolidate that power to just the Tudors in England for such a long period of time. Elizabeth rules from 1558 to March 24th, 1603, when she dies, just short of 45 years. And so she has this magnificent cult of people who absolutely adore her. And by having people adore her, they also adore the Tudor family, which really legitimizes the Tudor family after a long period of chaos. And now we're going to Margaret Tudor, who really were stepping back to Henry VII and Elizabeth of York's daughter. So Henry VII, like I said earlier, was the first Tudor ruler, which makes Margaret Tudor the first Tudor princess. When she marries into Scotland at the age of 12, she's able to be a tangible representation to the world, really all of Europe, of the Tudors. They see her in a foreign court. She marries the King of Scotland, James IV, when she's 12, like I said, and James IV classically dies. So now she has, similar to Margaret Beaufort and a lot of the women in this situation, like Catherine de Valois, now she has a toddler who is King of Scotland. They're not usually very good at that. So she serves as regent for him for 2 years, which keeps him safe in that period because she is an English woman ruling in Scotland over Scottish men. She's not extremely popular and there's quite a few rebellions, but she manages to hold her ground until he's able to rule, which establishes James V as the King of Scotland. James V marries a French woman and has Mary Queen of Scots, who might sound familiar to you all. Separate opinions about. Mary Queen of Scots has James VI of Scotland, but more importantly has James I of England. And so after Elizabeth I dies in 1603, James I of England comes over from Scotland to England to rule England, which means that even today in contemporary monarchy, the Tudor bloodline remains. Elizabeth II is related 16 times back to Margaret Tudor. Okay. Any questions on this period, the canonizing period? Okay. So what does it all mean? I love the Tudors. I hope that you might have guessed that. But beyond the fact that they're interesting and complex and full of trauma, they also pose a lot of ideas about the way that women are able to garner power before the 20th Amendment, or the 19th Amendment in 1920. So, like I said, we have agnostic primogeniture and we have Tudor's women's influence, which is so clearly juxtaposed. So 2 things that I want you to take away from this. First of all, historical figures are often so easily put into one box. We could say that Catherine de Valois was a queen consort who just sat around until her husband died and then she disappeared. But really, she defied Parliament. She was an active person who chose to make her own path, and in that created the entire Tudor family and put them on their path to glory. The other thing that I want you to take away is that history is never as simple as we think that it is. We like to say that women have this linear narrative from no rights to some rights to all of the rights, but it just doesn't work that way. We can see that through the way that each of these women is able to garner agency, garner power, garner glory, garner fame for their family, and the way that these mothers specifically are able to do that is really exciting. Any questions overall? Yes.
First of all, Stephanie, your presentation is fantastic. I love the amount of knowledge that you have and the sort of very candid, casual way you present it. I think it's wonderful. In your research about the English families, have you seen any parallels, say, in the Asian dynasties or the old Jewish dynasties?
So I typically don't research that. I usually stay in Europe. I think it's really fascinating to look at English dynasties because even if you look at France, a woman never ruled France. So the way that England, in this protracted period of 1066 to, we can even say today, has so much more examples of women, I think is really fascinating in the Western culture. But I'm sure it's really interesting how it works in the Eastern culture too. Okay. Thank you so much, guys.
Emily Macapaleo. Originally from upstate New York, began attending the O'Neill School halfway through her junior year. Throughout her academic career as a National Honor Society scholar, she has served in over half a dozen leadership positions and competed as a varsity athlete in rifle. Emily's passion for disability studies stems from her personal life and family. She started a drug prevention coalition in her community when she was in 8th grade and led it for 5 years, which prompted her interest in pharmaceuticals. She plans on obtaining bachelor's degrees in biology and chemistry through a dual major program and then going into pharmacy. Welcome, Emily.
So today I'm going to be talking to you all about healthcare for disabled Americans, more notably healthcare regulation and pharmaceutical access for American adults with disabilities. So, first off, we're going to start off with language, because before discussing any group of people, it's important that we use informed and respectful language. By using person-first identification, we acknowledge a quality or characteristic that someone has without defining them by it when first talking. By referring to someone as a person with a disability instead of a disabled person, we recognize their humanity before recognizing their ailment. An example of how identity-first language can be harmful is like when we refer to someone who's in a wheelchair as being confined to a wheelchair, simply because we see that they're seated in one. Although some people may experience their disability this way, these terms can't be used as descriptors of a verified experience, but are only projected onto disability. Living in a society that prides itself on acceptance and inclusion, especially in recent years, the words in which we use when speaking to and referring to other people has become increasingly important. By denying a group which makes up nearly 20% of our United States population proper respect for their identity through language, we devalue their lives and lived experiences. So first off, access. Access can come in multiple forms. Whether it be physical access to a location through handicap spots or sidewalk approaches. It is affected by many things, including the severity of one's disability, which typically is a direct correlation. The more severe, the less the access. Financial status, which as financial status improves and increases, there's typically greater access. And familial support, because everyone needs support to get through anything. And for healthcare purposes, it's also good to have a support system. Then we're going to move on. So today, I'm going to be focusing specifically on two types of disabilities, developmental and chronic condition disabilities. For a developmental disability, it typically appears relatively early in life, and those who become disabled in later years are due to chronic conditions. An example of a developmental disability would be spina bifida, cerebral palsy. And a chronic condition example would be hearing loss or diabetes, which we typically associate with the older population. Individuals who fall into these two categories experience healthcare very differently, and societally we also express very different attitudes towards these people if we see that they present physically with a disability versus it's something that they experience in their own time. So identity. When it comes to identity, every individual has both a given and a chosen identity. The label of being disabled is typically assigned as a piece of one's given identity. Because of the assigned nature of having a disability, it is often seen as something to be fixed or eradicated. Something that without, those same individuals could lead normal lives. Although many social groups preach on how inclusivity should be valued and encouraged, the reality is that those who don't fit into the mold of other that people are willing to accept are suppressed. Because of the unacceptance of individuals who don't fit our prototype of other, people with disabilities and their families often reject these labels. However, acknowledging these same labels is necessary for healthcare and insurance purposes. Potentially vital benefits are dependent on an individual's ability to prove their limitations by checking off figurative boxes as determined by those healthcare providers and companies. For example, for Social Security disability benefits, an individual whose disability is onset by drug abuse does not qualify for disability aid, which directly affects their access. Labels change the way that people perceive and treat others, although it is not necessarily the labels that many have a problem with, but the negative connotations that come along with them from strangers. I learned the weight of these negative and unjustified perceptions as a young child. My family and I would go to the grocery store or out running errands, and people would pull their children away from my brother and make snide remarks. I believe that a majority of these hurtful and demeaning actions come from a lack of education. Even as a young child, I found myself often repeating the refrain, if they knew better, they wouldn't do what they do. Education is such a fundamental part of our appropriately communicating with one another and being able to understand, not just to sympathize with the world around us. As a part of our ever-changing community, it is beyond important that we understand how to properly interact with people we may not relate to or have anything in common with. If we learn to respect and understand each other, we can better serve those in our community who require these further accommodations. We easily confuse quality care with the quantity of care made available. Just because the number of treatment options is on the rise doesn't necessarily mean that people can access these treatments. For example, the FDA and pharmaceutical industry love to point at graphs like this, which display the number of newly approved drugs over time to prove how great the market is doing. That if we're producing more drugs in less time, we must be doing something right. However, just looking at the number of approved drugs doesn't call into question their quality or innovativeness. This means that all of those seemingly new drugs could be treating the same curable illness, giving us a false sense of success in the pharmaceutical market. Looking at recent drug approval statistics, these specifically being from 2019, between two conditions, spina bifida and migraines. Spina bifida, if you don't know, is split spine, which is typically characterized as someone being in a wheelchair, typically presenting with paralysis. Through these statistics, it displays the repetitive nature of approvals. Even though these two conditions affect a similar percentage of the United States population, being around 20%, there's a very large discrepancy in how many drug treatments are actually available. For conditions like spina bifida, drugs tend to treat and mask symptoms, whereas a condition like migraine has options for preventative care and treatment. This distinction further underscores the quick fix mentality in America's healthcare systems and the nearly incorrigible dynamic of how care is perceived in our society. So this is a quote from the Harvard Medical Journal in 2019, which states, The majority of drugs approved over the last 5 years offer little clinical advantages over other products already on the market. So, if these new medications have no real clinical advantages or benefit, then why are so many resources going into their production? To put it simply, the answer is money. Ultimately, pharmaceuticals is a business which profits off of insurance. However, when people don't qualify for disability insurance benefits and medications are becoming more expensive, how can we maintain the expectation that everyone can afford their care as prescribed and directed by the physicians? We can't. So this directly ties to income. The cost of pharmaceuticals is a barrier that can discourage and even prevent an individual with a disability from receiving vital medications and treatments. Because of practices like wage displacement, which is when employers calculate wage for workers with disabilities based off of productivity rates as compared to their able-bodied coworkers, the increase in cost of drugs can directly be tied to drug noncompliance. When the cost of vital care already exists outside of a reasonable range and wages are unreasonably low, the result of drug noncompliance is inevitable. Drug noncompliance is defined as an inability to reasonably obtain and afford medications. Over 1.3 million people with disabilities experience noncompliance, and over half of those 1.3 million people list cost as the primary reason. The likelihood of noncompliance can be increased by a multitude of factors, such as having a severe disability, poor health, low income, lack of insurance, and a high number of prescriptions. All of these typically go hand in hand. When having a diminutive income to pull from to pay for resources, care, necessities, and wants, even the slightest increase of these already high-cost medications can be detrimental. In conclusion, the condescending attitudes in our society towards people with disabilities affects their ability to receive proper and adequate care. As medical access decreases, there is a sense of forced dependence that is pushed onto people. Members of society and professionals alike mistake a systematic lack of access as one's inability to be independent in our society. With increased access programs, medical assistance, and lower drug costs, we actually lessen the burden that obtaining health care can place on people with disabilities and really increase their opportunity for independence. Thank you.
Great. Our final speaker for the evening is Victoria Mills. Victoria has attended the O'Neill School since middle school. She has had a lifelong passion for environmental and geological sciences. Her first foray into agriculture took place on Flow Farm, where she was instrumental in the planning and construction of a 3,400 square foot high tunnel. Mark is confirming. At school, she has founded and led an organic gardening club and was an active member of the Science Olympiad team. Victoria will attend Smith College in the fall, where she will pursue a degree in geosciences and environmental science and policy. Welcome, Victoria.
Hello, everyone. It is my pleasure to talk to you today about my research project entitled Adaptations for the United States Agronomy, Applications of Traditional Agricultural Methods in the Face of a Changing Climate. Now, right off the bat, because of my mother, I will give you a definition for agronomy, because when I first read her the title, she was like, well, what's that? Which is entirely fair. Agronomy is a portmanteau, a mashup of two words, of agriculture and economy, and it describes an agricultural system wherein the primary goal is profit and not the efficient feeding of a local community. Now, I would first like to talk to you about the history of the United States agronomy. If you were at the little mini presentation this morning, you'll know that I didn't speak about this, whereas I feel that to get the real gravity of the situation, we have to address the history of the cultures and the people who brought us to where we are today. And the history of the United States agronomy begins with colonialism, and there was no room for cash crops in Europe anymore, and so the New World was ripe and new, and there were It's a whole lot of land where you could chop down all the trees and no one would even stop you, and you could grow tobacco and cotton and sugar. Now, obviously, this depended on the exploitation of many types of people, largely enslaved African peoples. And the colonialism model of agronomy completely destroyed many native food systems. Real quick, a definition of a food system for you. It's a system through which a civilization is fed. One example being agriculture, which is by and large the most common today. Another example would be a hunter-gatherer society or a fishing-based community. But so colonialism was our first foray into our agronomy that we have now. And because of the destruction of native food systems, we never really had the opportunity to establish anything other than an agronomy, because it began that way, and so it persisted that way. And eventually it persisted. Eventually, after the abolition of slavery, it evolved into sharecropping, which is a subject that my dear Aunt Claudia has made an entire documentary about. And sharecropping is a practice of one landowner renting out land to tenants who would farm the land, and in exchange for the land they had, they would give back to the landowner a portion of the profits or of the crops. And this, of course, was just another way of exploiting the agricultural workforce. And now, before I move on to the current phase of the industrial agronomy, I would like for us to look at this fun graph of census data. I have a lot of graphs in this. So our blue line here is showing the number of farms in the millions in the United States. The red line is the average number of acres per farm in the hundreds. And the green line is the amount of land being farmed. And as you can see, there's a positive slope up until the 1930s. More and more farms are happening. They're about the same size or maybe a little smaller. It's because of the division of land through sharecropping, and because as the United States progressed westward, the idea of manifest destiny continued and influenced people to go out and start their new farm in the land of opportunity, further destroying native food systems. But so, as you can see, the sharp uptick in the 1930s, and then it plummets. What happened there? Whose fault is that? Tractors. It's tractors' fault. So in the 1930s, tractors became an efficient enough means of farming that they had an advantage over pack animals. And the thing about tractors is you only need one guy to do a tractor. You don't need like 7 taking care of a bunch of animals. So it's much more efficient, and it requires a much smaller labor force. And of course, because tractors are really expensive, only those with a lot of money to back their agricultural adventures could purchase one, which forced out the small farmer from the American agronomy. And so as you can see, the number of farms decreases, amount of land per farm greatly increases, till after our little gap in the census data, ask the USDA, not me, it stabilizes over the last 20 years. And USDA stopped recording data on working animals entirely in the 1960s. Now we're in the age of industrial agriculture. So there's a huge gap between small farmers and corporations. The demographic of the agricultural workforce has changed as the culture surrounding agriculture has changed. Now, because a lot of agriculture is automated, industrial agriculture largely relies on migrant workers. You will see that the underlying theme in the American agronomy is exploitation of minorities, unfortunately. But all of this has resulted in the United States agronomy today being an absolute economic powerhouse. This is my fun pie chart of the global GDP, global gross domestic product, so the whole world's GDP. And as you can see, the US has a sizable chunk. Unsurprising, we're a Western country, we have a lot of land, we have a lot of people. But you can also see that the US agronomy accounts for 1.2% of the global GDP. Now this is data from 2019, so it may have fluctuated a bit. But 1.2% may look like a little slice of the pie on our front graph, but it is equivalent to the entire country of Turkey. So it is no small amount. And because of this, because it is such a huge industry and sustains so many people, the importance of maintaining the U.S. agronomy as it goes forward is incredibly high. It supports many people, it supports our economy, it supports local communities, and its biggest threat today is climate change, because obviously when the weather changes, the amount of plants and where you can plant them changes a lot too. So, in my presentation, we're going to go through our planting together. We're going to have a fun little journey. And I have 3 traditional agricultural methods that I will be sharing with you today. Please note that I define traditional agricultural method as an agricultural practice with pre-industrial origins. So while there are many other agricultural practices that are very relevant to maintaining agriculture in the face of climate change, if they have post-industrial origins, we're not going to be talking about this today. So first we're going to start with our dirt. All important. You gotta have good dirt to start. So let me introduce the most famous dirt. If any of you have ever gone on a walk with Mark Epstein around the Epstein's farm, you know what this is. So this is terra preta. It is found in the Amazon River Basin. As you can see, there's the dark earth. That's terra preta. Terra preta means dark earth in Portuguese. And it was discovered by Spanish colonizing. Because obviously Europeans had a lot of prejudices against South American natives. They were like, whoa, what a coincidence that these people have all this cool dirt. That's so weird. It was, of course, actually created through years of intentional agricultural cultivation of the land. And it was up until recently, it was sold as, like, you could buy this dirt from this specific place, which is really bizarre to me. Imagine ordering in some fancy dirt for your farm. But so the ancient Amazonians created this through slash and char farming, which is the practice of destroying plant material on a field, turning it in, Mark's nodding, and setting it on fire, essentially. And so as it burns in this low oxygen environment, it creates a very stable carbon, and you get terra preta. Now, our modern equivalent of terra preta is called biochar. So this is a biochar kiln at Flow Farm, my farma mater. There you go, Mark, that was a joke. And it is very big. If you look like way in the background, Max is standing by a pole back there. Max, if you want to stand up for a height reference, go ahead. You don't have to. Max, be my height reference. That's how tall Max is. So the biochar kiln at Flow Farms produces biochar using waste wood. How does biochar and terra preta work? Well, biochar is plant matter or other organic matter. The plant matter is most effective, burned in a low oxygen environment, and through the magic of chemistry, more of the carbon from the original plant matter is maintained in the created charcoal. And biochar is adsorbent. I know we talk about absorbent things a lot, but adsorbent describes something that attracts things to its surface. Why is that important? Because plants have these things in them called xylem and phylum. And I know this is a very technical term. They're like plant veins. And xylem and phylum, when burned, are maintained, creating a lot of surface area to have things adsorbed to, which is very key in maintaining the nutritional health of your soil. And soil treated with biochar can have up to 16 times more, can hold up to 16 times more water than untreated soil, which in the face of climate change and longer temperatures and more unreliable weather patterns can be quite beneficial. So, here's some pictures of Flow Farm once again. You can see the walking paths are entirely sandy. This is what Mark loves to point out. The walking paths are entirely sandy because it is in the sandhills, and the treated fields are much darker, even on the topsoil that's been like absolutely baked by the sun. So now that we have our dirt prepared for our climate-ready agronomy, let's move on to our plan for planting. My next traditional agricultural method is an incredibly common one that you probably know. It's crop rotation. Vicki, we all know about crop rotation. We learned about it in 5th grade. Yeah, I know, give me a minute. So crop rotation is prevalent in basically every agricultural practice. It's kind of a universal constant because of how effective it is. But our first archaeological evidence of crop rotation originates 8,000 years ago in the Middle East. It is likely that crop rotation has existed as long as agriculture has, but that's the oldest solid evidence that we have. So obviously crop rotation is a practice of rotating your crops. And that just basically means one season you have one thing, the next season your field is either fallow, unplanted, or you have a different crop there. And crop rotation can reduce pest problems, infection rates, and is better for local ecosystems than continuous monocropping. So here's some of my favorite data on crop rotation. This data, I know it's very complex, but I'll talk you through it, I promise. It's the result of a 30-year study on some American farms, and it examines the relationship between farm yields and rotational complexity. So you'll see on there RCI a couple of times. That stands for Rotational Complexity Index. Basically, the more frequently a crop is rotated, or the more variety of crops in a rotation, makes the rotational complexity index greater. So in our first graph, we have how an increase in rotational complexity index affects maize yields, and if they're in the yellow, that means that an increase in rotational complexity index increased maize yield. In our graph B, it is examining how those benefits are affected as stress decreases. And as stress decreases, the benefits remain pretty standard. They're still in the yellow. And in our graph C, we have how maize yield gains are affected by rotational complexity index. Once again, solidly in the yellow. And in graph D, we have how the effects of rotational complexity index were affected as stress increased. And now this is key because stress on plants can be caused by changing climates. And so as our rotational complexity index increases, we're getting even better results, which is really good. So this is a fun little graph of, on the left we have corn grown for grain in 2021. This is more USDA data. And then we have soybeans grown for consumption in 2021. And as you can see, they have near identical ranges. And so it is my argument that it would not take much out of the United States agronomy to increase our rotational complexity, at least between corn and soybeans, which are the two biggest crops grown in America. So now that we have our plant plan and our plants are planted, it's time to deal with pests. That was a lot more peas than intended. Increases in pest population are forecasted by the USDA in nearly all examinations of climate change forecasts. And here are 3 things that cause increases in pest populations and why they cause it. So monocropping, which is the practice of having one plant in a field, you know, like when you drive around the Midwest and it's just all corn, that's monocropping. And that creates concentrated populations of insects. And then climate change can cause longer warm seasons, which means you can have more pest generations per season. And you can get And because there's warmer temperatures overall, a greater population of pests will survive in winter. And because of this, you get more opportunity for pests to either endure pesticides and other methods, or to evolve from the selective pressure to be resistant to them, which is not preferable. We do not need super insects. That's not the plan. My proposed solution is the ever popular neem oil. You can find it in your local Ace Hardware. Please just ask my aunt. And so neem oil is the cold pressed oil of the neem plant, which is native to South Asia and not the Middle East, as I said this morning. My apologies. But so neem oil contains a chemical compound called, pardon me for a minute, azadirachtin, which can permeate into plants that it is applied to and essentially just tastes really bad to bugs. They do not like it. Some bugs it kills, others it repels. In a study done on flower beetles, which do not only eat flower, flower beetle population was implanted in a maize storage silo, and it was found that there was a 13 to 73% mortality rate of the flower beetle population when neem oil was applied. And the reason neem oil is a preferable solution to chemical pesticides is because with chemical pesticides you get a lot of undesired side effects and much more drastic selective pressure, which is going to create your superbugs faster. Ideal. Whereas neem oil, because it's a naturally derived compound, will decompose in the soil, and with it, its effects will also decompose. So if, let's say, you're farming one field and you've decided to let it lay fallow, unplanted, the next season, the bugs that live there won't be continuously poisoned by remains of chemicals in the soil. And that's nice for the bugs, but it's also nice for us because then that removes some of that intense selective pressure on our insect populations. So now that I've told you all my fun science about climate change and agriculture, why does it matter? So agriculture has culture in the name, for good reason too, because a lot of our lives are influenced by the food we eat and centered around it. And climate change changes crops, which changes communities. For example, in Costa Rica, which is obviously famed for its coffee, some higher altitude growers are having to give up farming coffee. They're giving up their generational practices of years and years of experience and knowledge because the coffee plants just don't grow there anymore because of changes in climate. They are, a lot of former coffee growers are now growing oranges or mandarins. And this is not something that the United States is immune to. If as climate change progresses, maybe the peaches could no longer live in Georgia, or maybe cherries could no longer grow in Michigan. And this would have really great impact on our individual cultures, which are so valuable to us. And so beyond the economic reasons for maintaining the United States agricultural system, it is also sort of a fight for our lives, and beyond that, it's a fight for what makes our lives worth living, our culture. Thank you. Here's another picture of Flow Farm. Any questions? Thank you.
Any questions for any of us?
Mr. Kelly.
Yeah. I loved your presentation. I was really interested in the soil treatment at Flow Farm. Did they find that increased yield, or it just helped them maintain yield given the climate change?
While it can affect yield because you're adding a higher carbon content to your soil that might not otherwise be there, it's mostly the greatest benefit is the longevity of it, and so there's less of a cost sunk into it in nurturing your fields, and also there's less of a sort of like, it's less chemistry and more gardening.
Thank you.
What can you say about your experience during this research project? Not the subject matter experience, but it's different from what the other students were doing and different from what you've done in other grades?
Certainly a lot different. A lot more work was put into it, and also a lot more direct attention was given to us to help us achieve the things and learn the things and research the things that we wanted to. We each had a separate class period dedicated just to this, and then I would go home and spend 10 hours doing some more separate research. And I think most importantly, it just was a practice for the research that I intend to do for the rest of my life. So.
Beyond that, it was also much more fulfilling than necessarily our other classes, because while learning calculus is fantastic and I love doing homework all the time, doing our work for SSRT was very fulfilling, like emotionally, because there were subjects that we really attribute a lot of value to and were inherently interested in. So it felt like more concrete than other classwork.
To add to what Vicki and Stephanie said, what I found very beneficial from SSRP, separate from the intensity and rigor of the program itself, was the friends that I made through it, which is very cliche. But quite honestly, there's not very many other places throughout high school experience, both in public and private school, where your peers who value the same things as you are selected out and you are put into a room with them, with the sole purpose of being nerds together. And yeah, so I found that very beneficial, and connections that we've made now will last hopefully the rest of our lives. And yeah.
If there are no other questions for our speakers, we're happy to, oh, Claire!
I have a question for Emily. You referenced, you referenced a disproportionate, you referenced the companies putting out kind of the delusion between it was high quality versus high quantity care. I was just getting this space elaborate on the negative effects that the community of disabled people, how that would affect them, how companies lie about that.
Right. So throughout the year, I gave smaller presentations in Mr. Poole's AP Chemistry classroom. Thank you for that opportunity. Where I went further into detail about the history of the FDA and the approval process for medications and drugs, where I did talk about that and how a lot of times the compounds that are in specific drugs is what's reused. So it's not necessarily the exact same drug, but the same components, which is what is actually doing the treatment that's filled in with the rest of everything else, is sold for much higher prices in these less potent forms, which basically is job security for everyone in the pharmaceutical market because they get to readapt and make the new forms of the same things.
Do you hope to change the pharmaceutical? I was being serious. It's not a rhetorical question.
Yeah.
Emily, have you seen some of the same struggles in countries that have socialized medicine, where some of the profit things are not a part of the equation? Have you seen it in comparison to?
So,
speak to that.
yes. Mainly my research this year has focused on the disabled population in the United States. However, I have looked a little bit into Canadian healthcare, which is very different from our own, It's essentially free healthcare, and everyone has a basic level of healthcare, which is not necessarily the case in the United States. But typically in other countries, such as Canada, drug prescription happens at a lower frequency. So although people are still given prescriptions and require medications to treat illness, the number of medications that any one given person is on is typically much lower, and thereby the cost is less. Hence this cycle. But yeah, it's not necessarily a solution, but it is a very different attitude in different countries.
I'm sorry, Emily, my So you mainly talked about developmental and chronic conditions. If someone, like say, someone was in the Army and they maybe lost their leg, would that be categorized as a chronic condition? And what differences would that have between ones that came about more naturally?
Right. So that's a very good question, actually. There are multiple different types of disabilities, which I didn't necessarily touch on for sake of consolidation and being concise. There are disabilities that are considered intellectual disabilities, emotional disabilities, or trauma disabilities, which is what you're talking about, so in the military. And then we kind of get into a whole other realm of insurance and regulations, because people who come from the military get treatment from Veterans Affairs. And it's their own chain of hospitals, which I'm sure a lot of people in this room have their own opinions on. But typically, the attempt there is to provide better access because people lived a certain lifestyle before their ailment. So the main focus there is quick care that they can get back to the lifestyle that they had before. So it's a very different attitude again, which is a lot of what healthcare has to do with nowadays, because the societal impact of how we talk to people, how we talk about them is ever changing. But yeah, it's a very good question. Thank you.
So I have one for Vicki. I've been hearing you talk about this all year, so I feel like I'm generally knowledgeable, but when you're talking about biochar, how long is it lasting? I know it's great for the soil and all that stuff, but...
I forgot to include my half-life statistic. I'm nervous, that's my bad. So in clinical trials, clinical trials, sorry, thinking about Emily too much. In laboratory conditions, biochar has had a half-life of up to 400 years, which obviously was not measured by letting it sit for 400 years. So the accuracy of that is debatable, but I think the longevity of the effects of terra preta are a testament to how truly permanent the effects of biochar can be.
Just a follow-up there. So what I really liked about your presentation was both the agronomy side of it and kind of looking at that journey from the colonialism forward, but also the agriculture side of it, the relationship. And to me, as you're looking at the topic of climate change, it's our relationship to what is that soil. What is the natural relationship that the soil is expressing? And so I just wanted to say that biochar is really kind of honoring that soil is a biological process as opposed to the reductionism of a chemistry process.
It feels respectful to the dirt.
Yeah.
That's what it does.
This is Elmore.
Have you done any comparison between shipping and its propagation for biochar?
They're not really comparable because biochar is a soil additive and propagation is an actual practice. So there can't really be a better one because they affect different things. Yeah, and working in tandem obviously is you get both the benefits. One doesn't take away from the other.
Scott Schmidt.
Question for Stephanie. So with the Tudor drama, it has made, it makes for amazing TV and stories and retellings. Have you been surprised by either the accuracy of what's been shown or the just complete distortion as you've gone through this?
That is one of my biggest pet peeves. So, am I surprised by the inaccuracy? No, never. Am I disappointed? Always. I think the greatest example, or just the greatest problem with it, is latching onto one narrative that we want to tell for each figure and just going straight with that one. The easiest example in the Tudor dynasty is obviously Henry VIII and his 6 wives, 2 of which he beheaded, etc. We love the drama of him being this crazy man whore, essentially. But that what we like to call him, and he ruled for 35 years, and he did way more than just have fun. But we like to keep it straightforward with his wives. So that's just a huge problem that I see all the time.
Wait, another question? Back here, do we have a question? Yes.
I just wanted to say congratulations to you ladies. You've done an excellent job, and it's a real honor to be a part of this program, and I think it's really amazing. And I just had a quick question for Vicki about the application of neem oil. I mean, aside from cost, obviously being number one, is there a reason why neem oil isn't more widespread? And
you can buy neem oil like in most gardening places, and I think the reason it's less widespread than say other chemical pesticides is because it's not like going to kill every bug in like a 10-meter radius, you know? Because the goal for industrial agriculture, when you don't have a team of people hand-picking hornworms off your tomatoes, is to just kill all the bugs, like as quickly as possible. And neem oil doesn't necessarily do that. It can be a deterrent. Some bugs it kills because the oil can clog up their orifices, which I can imagine is not a very pleasant way back. But overall, it's just not as deadly, which when you are a part of the United States agronomy and your standards are so high, and God forbid a tomato have a hornworm hole in it, it's not conforming to the same standards necessarily, because the crops sold to us in grocery stores have gone through like a heavy vetting process. They basically had a job interview for our dinners. And they select away the ones with damage to them, and you're more likely to get some minor damage to a fruit or vegetable if you use neem oil, because the bug will come and take a bite and then it goes, you know. Anyways, this is also me being a proponent for eating slightly weird looking fruits and vegetables. I promise you they're okay.
Okay, if there are no more questions, let's give our panelists another round of applause.